I felt so insignificant looking up at this beautiful peak that was getting shrouded in mist and weather closing in really quick, and we've got our avalanche beacons on, and it's all quite unnerving. But that just feeds the addiction, that adrenaline that you just feel.
Kia ora, and welcome to The Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Jonty, and in each episode I chat with people who share a passion for exploring this incredible country. We'll hear about the tracks they love, the huts they return to, the lessons they've learned, and what keeps them heading back into the bush. My guest today is Jerry Van Lier, creator and host of the Tararua Fever podcast. Jerry has a real passion for the Tararua Ranges, one of New Zealand's most rugged, rewarding, and at times notorious tramping areas. Through his podcast, he shares stories of adventures, mishaps, and special character of the Tararuas, capturing what makes these hills such a beloved testing ground for trampers. I'm delighted to welcome him to the podcast. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Jonty. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
So let's start with the start. Where did you grow up, and what are some of your earliest memories of being outdoors?
I am a Wellingtonian by heart, by trade, by everything. Actually, Island Bay more so than anything else, where I grew up, my mum, my dad, my brother. However, ironically, my parents are lifelong members of the Hutt Valley Tramping Club.
So when was your first tramp, and what do you remember about it?
I can remember my first tramp quite clearly. There's a few photos, actually. I was 6 years old. And my dad took myself and a friend of his, also from the Hutt Valley Tramping Club, on a trip starting from the Waiohine coastline, just south of the Tararua Ranges. And we went around that coastline that wraps right round to, I think it's called the Muka Muka stream. Then we went up the Muka Muka Valley and up and over the Southern Saddle, right next to Mount Matthews, and down the other side. We did it across 2 days. And I did that trip again, it must have been about 2017 with some friends, and I came back and said to my dad, "You were mad taking a 6-year-old on that trip. That seems just completely nuts." But yeah, that was my first trip. Quite grateful for that. It was quite different to how I remembered it actually doing it later on in life, but a great trip that I'd recommend to anyone.
Especially at the age of 6, I mean, Mount Matthews, that's a prime age to summit.
Look, there's this one photo of us about to begin the trip, and I looked at it again, and I'm just a tiny toddler. I'm very clearly not at the age where I should be tramping yet, I think. So I like to give my dad a little bit of stick for that.
So was that the moment you fell in love with tramping, or was there a moment a bit later on?
I think that, from there, it was probably mostly my dad taking my brother and I out on small trips as we were growing up. But there were lots of other little hobbies that we had. I've played football every year from the age of 5 years old. So I'm a massive footballer, a fanatical fan of the English Premier League and all that. So I've got lots of strings to my bows and stuff like that. But one thing that I always felt I identified with was being a tramper. Even in my teenage years when I might not have engaged with it as much. I always appreciated that upbringing from my dad. And then it might have been more into my early 20s that I re-engaged with tramping again. And possibly at that point really fell in love with it.
And the tramping, do you do it solo, or was this with the groups? Was there a particular group of people that you went out with, or you have a bit of a mixture about groups or solo tramping?
The way I go tramping is probably just with friends. I actually tend not to go on solo trips, more so for just safety and my own perception of how I feel out there by myself. It is always nice to have your alone time and stuff like that, but I think that my dad gave me some specific sets of rules when we were growing up, was to never go by yourself, always have another person. The other rule is always put your jacket at the top of your pack for when the weather closes in. I just tend to be a bit binary about some of those things. But having said that, I'm still a member of the Hutt Valley Tramping Club. I pay my fees every year and I really enjoy that club. However, I find that I can do my own trips with my own preferences probably more, or I wouldn't say better, because tramping clubs have a lot of benefits from joining, but I just prefer being the master of my own destiny when it comes to tramping trips, I think.
The demographics are a bit different. I've done a few talks to the Hutt Valley Tramping Club, and I think maybe it's a generational thing. I really appreciate, and they've done amazing stuff, and there's so many people with such amazing experience, but it does feel generational kind of divide.
I certainly would agree. Back in the day when my parents were part of that club and other clubs and stuff like that, the done thing was join a tramping club if you want to go tramping. And with Asian demographics and stuff like that, there's slightly less common threads, I guess, there for me.
They're still hardcore though. Like when I've read and seen some of the trips that they do, I'm like, if I'm still doing that when I'm at their age, I'll be very happy.
I couldn't agree more. And You just touched on something there about the wealth of knowledge that they have. It's still worth keeping in touch with them. Some of my dad's friends who are part of the club as well. If I ever just need a little bit of information for a trip that I'm planning, they're always there and really great. Yeah, it's still very beneficial.
Do you tend to be the trip planner and instigator, or do you have friends who do all the research and you tag along with them?
That's a really good question. I think within my close circuit of friends who I go tramping with, you will have heard a few of them on the podcast on Tararua Fever by now. I don't know how they'll feel about me saying this, but I think possibly I am the instigator. I'm the one that might send a message saying, hey bro, are you free on XYZ dates? I'm looking at the map at the moment and thinking of something a bit crazy. With the Hutt Valley Tramping Club, I've done a bit in Nelson Lakes, which is a phenomenal area. I think I was about 14 or 15 when we had a club trip where we were going in from Lake Rotorui and heading over the Travis Saddle and down the West Sabine River and out the other end. We got stifled, though, going over the Travis Saddle. Basically, a massive blizzard came in and we had to go back. A person actually hurt themselves as well. They hurt their back. I can't remember. I think that person might have got to chop it out. But basically, it was a trip where we came out the same way we came in. It wasn't quite a circuit. But that next summer, my dad was determined that we complete that trip, so we went back and did it again. Another trip that I've done in Nelson Lakes was again part of the Hutt Valley Tramping Club, where we did Mount Cupola, led by the great Murray Presland, who's a part of the Hutt Valleys. We didn't quite get to summit Mount Cupola again because the weather turned. I just remember we left Mount Cupola Hutt at about 6 a.m. and by about 8 a.m. we were right on the mountain, the Moonga, and I just looked up, and I wouldn't say that Mount Cupola is any more significant than any other mountain in that area. Mount Angelus, Mount Hopeless, Mount Travis is the highest. Compared to the Southern Alps, etc., they're not super high, but I felt so insignificant looking up at this beautiful peak that was getting shrouded in mist and weather closing in really quick, and we've got our avalanche beacons on, and it's all quite unnerving. But that just feeds the addiction, that adrenaline that you just feel. One of the other awesome tramps that I've done is for university. When I was doing biodiversity and ecology, we did have a field trip down to Nelson Lakes, and gosh, it's the opposite side of Mount Roberts, and I'm forgetting that range. But for our case study, we had to climb to the top, and we were taking samples of lichen and noting how that changed with altitude. And so we took all this data, and then we got back and we reported back to our supervisor, and he said, go back and do it again tomorrow and just note your difference in data. And I think I was the only one in the group that was absolutely stoked with that idea, because you're climbing to about 1,500, 2,000 meters at that point, and gosh, that couldn't have been more appealing to me.
It's interesting. The first two trips you mentioned, you had to turn back or change plans due to weather. So what's the closest you've come to disaster whilst tramping?
Gosh, I don't know if we've ever come close to a disaster. One of my closest friends, Kent, and I, who do a lot of tramping in the Tararua Ranges together, we've had to amend our plans a bunch of times. There was one time we were heading along the Renata Ridge to Elder Hutt. The wind was so strong. It was classic springtime. It was probably round about this time of year where it gets a bit warmer, and those spring winds, just those nor'westers get really strong. And so we definitely had to change plans a little bit. We went back to Renata Hutt and we stayed the night there and came down the Waiohine Forks the next day. I've done the Southern Crossing in really ropey conditions before as well. We plodded on and went straight through, but coming up the beehives at about 9 o'clock in the morning and having to duck down behind the little ledge next to the track to have a bit of respite while just smashing a bit of scroggin in your mouth and a few lollies to keep going, that's been really ropey. I was on Outward Bound at about the age of 24, and we were climbing Mount Cullen, and one of the members of our group got hypothermia, on the verge of hypothermia, maybe I should say. I don't know if they actually were hypothermic at the time, but we did have a doctor in our group who identified it quite early, and we were able to, pivot. But we'd just been setting up camp, so we were in a static environment. We weren't travelling at that point in time. One thing that I am always really cautious of is just your layering and how you're wearing your gear, your undergarments. I think the person was quite hot, so they'd taken off a lot of their layers and were just wearing a t-shirt. But because you're so hot and you're not really feeling the cold as much, but even though it's freezing, you can actually, by nature of it, start going into quite a cold state without even realising. Yeah, something to watch out for.
What is your favourite piece of tramping equipment?
I love my tramping boots. My tramping boots and my tractors. I have a leather pair of scarpers from Outdoor Bivouac. They cost about $500, but I think they're worth every penny. And I prefer the leather because they're so durable. And I think in the Tararua Ranges particularly, you can end up doing quite a lot of river walking. So they're really strong in the river. They get quite heavy and stuff. But I think in contrast, and I'm no boot expert, Jonty, but I think in contrast to maybe a Gore-Tex type boot where it's nice and light, but it can rip a little bit more easy, I've found my leather scarpers, they're my number ones. Maybe not quite answering your question in terms of a piece of equipment that I use that's one of my favorites, but I converted to a MSR Primus a few years ago. It's got the gas bottle that you fill with methylated spirits. And just in contrast to, say, the gas canners that you use, and it's quite quick. You screw your gas canister onto your head and click and go, and you basically got a flame in seconds. I was trying to think of more environmentally friendly ways to tramp, and I thought that changing the energy use that I use, converting away from gas into what could be arguably a more sustainable source in methylated spirits, might be a way to go. I find it a bit scary to use. It only burns at one temperature, and that's just bloody hot. Getting it going takes a little bit of, I wouldn't say faffing, but you've got to be quite precise. You've got to turn the knob and let a little bit of meths through, and then you light the thing, and you've turned it off again, and then you light it. It burns hot for a wee while, and then you can hear it, and you've got to turn it on again before at a certain moment. And the one problem that I really have with it, and I'd love anyone to help me with it, is once you're finished and you turn it off, if you need to turn it on again a couple of minutes later because you've gotten to boil the water for after dinner or something like that, I wouldn't know how to get it going again. There's fuel in the line. I don't know if it's whether just turning the knob and lighting a flame next to it, but I've had it before where it's blown up in my face a little bit, and it scares the hell out of me. Being sustainable can come with a cost.
What are your favourite huts in the Tararua Ranges, and which are the ones that you never want to go back to again?
Really good question. Tarn Ridge has been suffering a little for quite some time, I think. And it's a hard one. I definitely get it. It's a really difficult one because it's quite isolated. So servicing that hut must be really difficult for Doc. I think it got struck by lightning a while back, maybe 5 years ago, maybe plus now. And so it'd been under quite a lot of repair, and it's not easy to repair a hut in that area. I think last time I was there was a couple of years ago with my partner, and there was just a lot of black mold where I think moisture had been getting in and stuff like that. There was also no water in the tank, I think actually the handle on the water tank had broken, so we couldn't access any fresh water, but there was a bucket full of more questionable water. I think all in all, Jonty, my favourite types of huts are those orange 6 bunkers, Mid-Waiohine, Pen Creek, Cow Creek, some of those really awesome ones in the bottom of a valley. They're quite romantic. They're a bit of a shack, but they're not too cold. They've always got a fireplace. Yeah, I really like those ones. Tonga Hook is a very nice hut. I'm very impressed with that one. Waiwai's just had a really nice recent birthday. So that we were just there a couple of weeks ago, and that was in really nice condition. I've been there when it's been a bit sad. Patawai Hut at Otaki Forks is always a really convenient one for when you're going in on a Friday night or at night to get an early start the next morning. But again, we've been in Patawai Hut. It's had quite a lot of rats around, cooking on the bench, and you see something crawling towards you and you turn around and it scurries off, and it's always a bit like, ugh. My dad's also had a rat chew through the bottom of his pack to his scroggin once before while he was sleeping. I don't know if I have a favourite one off the top of my head right now. Actually, I'll say Elder Hut right now. That is a fantastic hut. Just a 4-bunker, so you've probably got to get there quite early. For those who are not familiar with Elder Hut, it's on the Renata Ridge as it goes up to Aston onto the Southern Crossing. And that's a very romantic spot. It's got a great view. It looks right over Waiohine Forks. You can't quite see Kapiti Island in the distance, or maybe you can on a really good day, but you've got Kapanui in the way. So, I'll say, if I have to choose a favourite right now, I'll say Elder.
Have you come across any major overcrowding issues in the Tararuas?
Totara Flats is a classic one, I think, where it's so convenient for families to bring their young ones in, or if you're not from Wellington or you're a tourist and you want to get a little taste of the Tararua Ranges, it's not too hard to get in. I was talking to the hut warden there, Brett Gillies, not long ago, and he said he's had 50 maybe plus people on a long weekend who turn up there. And I think that's one of the reasons why they also made it a bookable hut now. One of the biggest pieces of advice when you're going out for a tramp and you're not necessarily familiar with the area is really just get a good gauge on where you're heading to and what time you might be able to get there, because huts can fill up quick. It's first in, first served most of the time unless it's bookable. And so you always need a little bit of a contingency plan otherwise. Kent and I were at Cow Creek quite a few years ago, and it filled up really quick, and we didn't have a spare tent with us at that point in time, and we managed to get a bunk. We were okay, but there were quite a lot of people who came afterwards. So the last people who did not have a tent, so they had to do a bit of horse trading to get a spot in someone else's, I think. So it's not the sort of situation that I want to be in. I basically always bring a tent now. I bring my NSR hubba everywhere. One of the things is when you go out, you're pretty much guaranteed to always see other people. And that's great. I think it's fantastic that people love getting out there so much. I think there's more diversity now than there has been in the past. I spoke with a guy called Andy Carruthers a while back, and he's got a documentary on running the SK, which is it's got its own running culture now, particularly for the SK event, which is the length of the Tararua Ranges. And so it's not uncommon to see runners out. And when I stop and talk to them, if they ever want to stop and talk to me, they often don't. I was heading out of Waiohine once, and I was just on plateau, and there was this woman coming through, and she was running to Maunga Hooker and out in one day. Yeah, I think the Tararua Ranges are as busy as they ever have been, I would say, Jonty.
What's your thoughts on the accuracy of the signage in the Tararuas?
One of the things that I think is hard for Doc and the Doc signs is that the Tararua Ranges can be particularly rugged. There's so many steep ups and downs that it makes travel times quite variable depending on skill and ability and experience and stuff like that. So to actually nail down a sort of average time to stick on a sign is not easy. But having said that, sometimes you see a sign and it's just so blatantly wrong anyway that you often see where people have etched into the sign saying, absolutely wrong. This is a more realistic sort of time frame, and I always have a chuckle when I see something like that. If you ever see a time frame that's 2 hours away or something like that, 2 hours is probably such a short time frame that it's probably not realistic at all. Don't take me verbatim on this. Maybe it is 2 hours, but I think particularly on those shorter time frames, if Doc's listed it, it's probably less realistic. I think it's probably more 3 to 4, and that's probably more common of what you'll see is 3, 4, 5 hours away or something like that.
I had a terrifying experience a few years ago around the Tararua Peak section. How have you found that, and what other hairy parts are there in the ranges?
Look, there are some hair-raising points in the Tararua Ranges. I think, like you say, on the way to Maunga Hooker from Bridge Peak, I think it's after the ladder when it's got the chains attached to the rock and you're going across there. I think that's more scarier than the ladder. I think you're alluding to that there. Gosh, especially in something like quite wet weather or a lot of clag. Good grief, I don't know how people do it. I was in Maunga Hooker, it was 2 days after New Year's 2023, and with my partner. And classic in the Tararua Ranges, at night the weather can just absolutely go to pea soup or porridge, and there was so much clag, and there were still people coming in 10, 11 at night. And I don't know, they're more braver than I am, Jonty, or ignorance is bliss. I don't know if there's too much difference between the two, but I don't want to do that sort of terrain and that sort of conditions. I just think you open yourself up for quite a lot of risk. But two other areas to note that I find possibly slightly more terrifying than Maunga Hooker is Broken Axe Pinnacles. That's pretty steep. But for me, I think the Waiohine Pinnacles between Arete and Tarn Ridge is, I had to stop with my partner Lex, and I'm carrying about 20 kilos on my back at that point in time, maybe 22. You're lopsided anyway, and then you're trying to scurry down a ledge that's just too far down for you to actually get a good foothold. You're trying to hold onto a rock that's all loose, and you've got about, I don't know, I'm speculating here, but like maybe 400 or 500 meters down either side of you. And it's not for the faint-hearted, is it? It's scary stuff. But look, this is why we keep going back, because once you've scuttled over the Waiohine Pinnacles, which takes about 20 minutes to half an hour, the adrenaline's pumping and I'm just having a blast. That's on the proviso that I've gotten across okay.
I understand that your wife is expecting your first child very soon, so how do you think that's going to impact tramping for you?
I just went to Waiohine a couple of weeks ago with my friends, and they were calling it Jerry's final tramp. I think romantically I'd like to have them in the front pack by the age of 18 months, 2 years old, and doing something that's still manageable for all involved. Even if it's just the Port Hills here in Christchurch, I think that would be quite nice. Just going back to the fact that I'm a Wellingtonian abroad, so to speak, I think with creating my podcast, I've joked that it's definitely me overcompensating for not being able to tramp in some of my favourite places in the Tararua Ranges, but maybe having a newborn will be a really good excuse to start going and exploring nature's doorstep, which we're so lucky to have here in Christchurch, in Arthur's Pass or beyond.
How have you found the podcasting experience?
It's been really great getting to interview such wonderful people who are passionate about the areas that they focus on. I'd like to say that there's a lot of weird and wonderful people out there, and I'd like to embrace it all. Learning about the bookable huts and why they're bookable I spoke with Celia Wade-Brown a while back, and she had some really good insights about some of the native flora and fauna in there. I'm talking to the Outdoor Access Commission quite soon about public access on private land, which is going to be really interesting. And I think that the Tararua Ranges are not without those sort of matters to consider there as well, particularly around Mount Reeves, or I think out on the Kapiti Coast there's a few areas where there's private land that allows trampers access. So having been in positions where, say for the public access side of things, where I have scuttled across private land without permission in the past, makes me reflect actually what and how should we be operating as trampers and doing that respectfully on private landowners' land, because somewhere like Lier at the Pose Road end, it's a privilege, not a right, for that farmer to allow us to keep going onto that land and accessing there. So how can we do that in the most respectful way possible is an insight that I've learned recently. We'll try to put that kaupapa forward in the next episode.
What's in your tramping bucket list?
If we just focus on the Tararua Ranges for now, my map gazing side of things, I've been looking at the Waiohine Pinnacles lately, and they look like, from when I've been up at a ret and on a really nice day looking across at the Waiohine Pinnacles, they just look crazy gnarly. And I think what I'd love to do is speak with someone who has gone up to Hirapai Hut from the Ekapuna Road end and gone across over Dundas or past Dundas and then come around over the Waiohine Pinnacles. I don't think I've spoken to anyone that's done that before, but I'm sure it must have been done. I also think that these are pipe dreams that I'd like to do from my map gazing. I think you said before that it's always way harder than we think it is from just looking at the map. But that would be really cool. And so that would bring you back down onto Cattle Ridge and you could drop down into Boring Stack from there. So a little bit of a circuit there like that. And another one that's been on my bucket list for the Tararua Ranges for a very long time. And I signed up to the Hutt Valley Tramping Club to do a trip there. Must have been about 2022 or 2021 is Winchcombe Ridge. Because I look at that and it takes my breath away. It's again, looks like one of the steepest pinnacle ridges in the Tararua Ranges, and I think it'll be fantastic to do. Unfortunately, that trip got cancelled because a massive storm came through and it just wasn't tenable. Elsewhere in New Zealand, I would love to go back to Nelson Lakes. I think Kahurangi National Park up to Dragon's Teeth would be really cool. I think exploring more in Arthur's Pass and maybe down to Fiordland would be really great. Unfortunately, I'm probably really focused on the Tararua Ranges still. I'm not over the trauma of leaving Wellington yet, so I'm still going to struggle to let it go for a wee while. I haven't bagged every hut in the Tararua Ranges, so there's probably still a few to bag. But like I said, I don't want to bag them all because I want to keep going back as well.
Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use. Tell a friend about it and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.